Thinking of our homeland and those who sing about it, there are those who doubt it is the land of the free. I created this company in order to be able to get away with things like introducing unexpected contemporary elements of dance and movement, of relatable context. I do it in English as often as possible, but every piece we use is, I think the technical term is we mess with a chestnut from the opera repertoire. And in language that I'm just beginning to understand and really appreciate from part of the conversation last night, I think I'm deconstructing, but I'm certainly appropriating the music, the DWEM music, dead white European males. Every piece that I do is built in that on a foundation of that. And I think
I've never heard that term.
Yeah, DWEM. Also recently, the last two pieces that I've done, I would have to say that I have started visiting and become conscious of the ways in which the pieces we are visiting the intersection of race and also cultural appropriation. So those are both things that, that is basic to all the work that my company does.
I love that. I think you said accessibility, and I feel like that's our big Pee-wee Playhouse word of the day. Like that's going to come up a lot tonight. I have so many questions about accessibility. Just to say, there's a lot of us on this panel that deal with DWEM, that are using the art forms of yesterday, and I am not a dead white man. So I think that's going to be a big thing that we discussed today. Garrett, you gave us some real big clues about what the source material is. Could you dig into, I can't even pronounce what the name of the original opera is. You're going to help me.
Yeah, so it's the opera is Die Fledermaus, or the bat is how a lot of people would translate that. Most folks who know my work know that I spent the first decade of my career as a professional bassoonist. So Die Fledermaus is an opera that I've had the pleasure of performing many times, I think 3 times. And the long story of it is about a chambermaid who gets her mistress's clothing and sneaks off to a party, and all of the hijinks that can happen there, with the central sort of ingredient, I'll say, being champagne. It's a very light opera with a lot of funny moments even in it. There's even a tune in the opera known as the Laughing Song that I'm sure you're familiar with, Gail. But in the aria in which this piece of music was derived or appropriated, I love that you use that word. I think that's very interesting. We have someone from afar, someone who's Hungarian, bringing into the land of Viennese waltzes and polkas the czardas, a dance and a music style from Hungary. And in this scene, we have just this song and this emotion about homeland and, oh, how beautiful it is. And I think in context, it's really interesting because this character, this mysterious Hungarian character, is coming among all of these Austrians, these, high cultured Austrians, who all of a sudden have to deal with their space being disrupted. And I feel like that's a lot of the conversation surrounding the arts and the general discourse these days, disruption of spaces and what we can do to change those spaces and make them ones that are more accessible to more people.
I find that story so relatable, kind of a pauper to prince story. But it also seems like when we're using a term like appropriation, and I think we're saying like a justified appropriation, we are recognizing something that was not accessible, something that wasn't relatable in that. There are so many barriers to access around the original piece, and they're abstract. I think the original opera is probably beautiful. Like I said, my background is not there. I don't want to offend any opera heads out there. But when we're talking about barriers, one that we can be really specific about is the language. The changing of the text really makes this sing in a new way. what other barriers were you facing with this that have changed? I'm thinking like venue, I'm thinking our general conception of what the opera world is. Does anyone have anything to say about that?
I'd like Garrett to talk about that.
Well, yeah, when we talk about barriers of entry, COVID has put everyone on the same playing field. The Met is dark. So that means, the largest of all of the institutions. So what that means is we're all on an equal playing field. And we really have the privilege, we have the benefit of reaching audiences that would have felt threatened by the space of an opera house, or, asking questions of, what to wear, or, why is there no one in this space who looks like me or can speak to my experiences. So when I think about, putting this on the digital front, I really think about the advantage in being able to reach new folks. But, as we were talking about, the different images, I think it's important to note that, a critique, something at least to think about is, who is benefiting from the pain and the anguish and the discomfort that are displayed in those images. I think that's why diverse perspective is so important when it comes to a work of art that represented so many different struggles and so many different perspectives, is really understanding that those are more than just images. Those are lived experiences of folks who went through and continue to face so much trauma. So, in spreading awareness about the things that, we want to spread awareness about through our art, I think we have to foreground that idea and consider it when we're putting things together. Who is benefiting from whose pain?
Mm.
So it certainly came up, and I was very honored to be able to include in this video. I got permission from a photographer named Stanley Foreman, and he permitted us to include a Pulitzer Prize winning image that he took, and it was the one of the person using the flag as a spear, and the image is called "The Soiling of Old Glory," and he took it in I believe it was in Boston somewhere in the 70s during when there was a lot of protests against busing integration and integration. And in learning more about Stanley and his work, I was very moved by to find out that I saw another image he took. It's an image of his other Pulitzer Prize winning image was of a mother, a young mother and a toddler. He captured them midair as they were falling to their death, having fallen off of a crumbling fire escape. There was smoke and all around, and they died. Or at least the mother died. I think the child's fall was broken by the mother's body. And that image has been used a lot, apparently, in photography school and in journalism curriculum, with raising the question: when is it exploitation of those people's pain? And the reason that image gets a lot of attention is because they were asking to balance the potential benefits of using that image or images. And the standard is, does it bring good? And can good come out of showing it? And in fact, that particular image of the two falling figures ended up within a very short period of time resulting in regulations about preventing that kind of accident from happening any further. So that became a kind of standard. Not that anywhere do I imagine that there's that level of importance here, but I tried to weigh each image against something like that. Is using it potentially more beneficial than the harm that it could cause? And in fact, I dropped, in the beginning, when I was starting this, I had not been part of this conversation, and it was, I contemplated using in the harsh reality, you know, the one about you need to hear their story, they've lived in harsh reality, I contemplated using the image of the lynching, the very famous image of the lynching with the people in front turning and smiling at the camera. And I just very clearly got the signal, no, there was too much trauma and harm associated with me the benefit of me putting it in there was way, didn't come close to the harm that it would cause. So, and I backed off on using I used blood as the suggestion of the violence that was done against Harvey Milk. It came to my attention, and like Steve said, maybe he said it yesterday. Maybe we made good decisions. Maybe we made good decisions 20% of the time. Maybe we made really bad decisions. And I think that's what's there to do but wait.
Oh, go ahead, Garrett.
I think the binary of good and bad can't be so clear when we're talking about the use of imagery, because what came to my mind as you were talking, Gail, was the story of Emmett Till and his mother's decision to have an open coffin, and that image was on the cover of Jet magazine, I believe, and it raised so much awareness around that. Being here in the Twin Cities, the fire, literal and figurative, surrounding the murder of George Floyd, has inspired so many conversations. I remember before it was all national news, it was very much local circulation of that video of him being killed. And I remember, initially having the response that we need to stop spreading murder porn. I don't know how I feel about that perspective so much now, because we know what that image did to the world, the reaction that it's inspired. I think the bigger question is, was the reaction to a good? Okay, more people are aware. What is going to be done with that awareness? I think if the use of some of these traumatic images, if the result is going to be nothing but awareness, no action, no actual change, we should reconsider their use. I think it just puts a responsibility behind the folks sharing those images to actually be a part of the actionable change and not only the spreading of awareness.
Okay. I think there's another idea that sort of came to mind from our previous conversation, the role of art, risk, and critique. I do struggle with this project, but I also realize that I can't learn more about it unless I throw myself into it, do something, and get critique for it, and maybe know what not to do next time, or maybe figure out a better way to express myself. But I thought a lot about our conversation yesterday. A lot of it has to do with risk and being an artist and accepting a risk. And I think ultimately the struggles I feel, I come down on that side. Well, you know what? I need to risk it to have a gain.
America, your sorrows are profound, your blood-stained and sacred ground, your purple mountain majesty divide us from sea to sea.
Something else I've kind of been thinking about is we talked about who this is for. Even for our white audiences, there's some things that we've done to this piece around language, around putting it in your living rooms. Garrett, you said something really great about opera, and the only thing I really knew about opera is that a good opera is in Italian and German and not English. That's the only kind of tropic thing I had heard. Could you dive into that more?
Yeah, I think when we talk about more generally increasing diversity in audiences and even who we see on stage, we have to accept the change in the general aesthetic. I think there's an aesthetic of foreign language art song that people are really used to when they think about the word opera. But all, as I mentioned yesterday, there are examples all over the repertoire of composers who believe that certain pieces of music should be performed in the language of the people, as you'll often see. The Magic Flute by Mozart is a great example of that. And actually, I believe Die Fledermaus is another example of the times I've performed it. Not all of them have been in English, but a couple of them were. So I think that sound aesthetic is a small, very granular example of what we need to be open to when we talk about really busting open opera, busting open the arts, and applying them to activism. How do we go even further? Maybe adding beats and 808s, maybe really centering new opera and the opera of new composers and living composers, maybe even inserting songs like these, renditions of songs like these in performances that are happening. We talk about yesterday, we were talking about the difference between an ally and an accomplice. Maybe an ally would have written this piece of music and created the imagery that we saw earlier. Maybe an accomplice, when the world opens back up and a company is performing Die Fledermaus, maybe an accomplice will perform this version instead of what was originally written, and face the equal reward and benefit from raising awareness, but also the same risk as Steve was speaking to. So I think all of those things have to be considered when we talk about the general aesthetics that have to change in diversifying opera, and changing language is a very, 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 very small part of that change in aesthetic, but a really important one, and one that can definitely have a huge impact when we talk about exposing new audiences to this sort of thing.
I've heard someone describe allyship being an accomplice as it costing you something, that it is performative allyship if you declare your values and then you don't have to do anything beyond that. And I think what you're saying is this is something that you build upon. There is a next step. This call to action is not finished in some way.
Because what has it cost people of color? Again, let's think about some of the images we saw in that in that project. People died, people went hungry, people were homeless. Even today, there's so much happening that that costs people of color, just to exist. There is a cost for that when you live in a white supremacist country under a white supremacist leader within an arts infrastructure that has historically centered Western Europe. So there is a cost there for people of color. When we talk about being an accomplice, when I talk about that anyway, I talk about taking on some of that cost. Maybe something you say in allyship to me will cost you someone's trust or cost you an opportunity. That's really the crux of what we're talking about when I say the differences between being an ally and being an accomplice. Is taking on the cost that people of color pay for just existing.
Make good trouble, walking hand in hand. We can do it, get to it, with others who listen.
One of the things I can't help but think is my experience going to a theater. I do a lot of, what do we call it, DWEM? I do a lot of DWEM work. I see a lot of DWEM work, and I'm often in billion-dollar buildings with mostly white presenting faces. And even that in itself is an alienating experience, to have everyone kind of check in with me before they laugh about something a Black person said on stage. Just the ownership of the space, the ownership of the art. I think there's a really abstract thing that this piece is doing there too, kind of democratizing who owns this. I don't know if that spurs anything for anyone.
I think that's exactly what the scene in the opera and what the piece of music is portraying. Again, we have this mysterious Hungarian amongst all of these other folks really owning the space, not just a part of it, but the center focus of it, singing this song, not only about, her experiences in that space, but how much she loves a homeland that is so beautiful that you people have no idea what it's about, but oh my goodness, let me sing a song about it for you. So I think when you talk about being, that feeling of isolation in those art spaces today, yeah, I definitely think there's a direct correlation there. I think one of the things that we brought up yesterday in that conversation was the discomfort in being racialized when you're not necessarily used to being racialized. In that moment in that opera, all of the people at that party had to think of themselves as something different because they were seeing something different. That mysterious Hungarian may be someone who always has to think of themselves as something different depending on, whatever they're doing outside of that scene in that opera. I think obviously that directly relates to folks of color, Black folks and others in the arts and otherwise today, really being used to thinking of yourself as someone different, someone who has a different experience or looks different. That's not always the experience for white folks in the arts. It's probably very rare unless, you're in the tradition of reggae or something. So I think, that all of those things, that's what makes the appropriation of this music, of that composition, such a great jumping off point for artistic expression and conversation. There's so many connections there.
Must be
there's just one thing I want to bring up from the other day, because in a way, I feel like it answers a question I had around this cultural gatekeeping. And when you talked about your Ethiopian piece, we had a discussion about what it means to be classic, what a classic art form is. I would love someone to talk about that. I found it so interesting.
Yeah, that was Garrett.
Sure. So, as I mentioned in my introduction, I do a lot of arts consultation. I talk to a lot of school groups. This COVID era has definitely, has helped make that more of a thing, when we're talking about virtual. But what I spend the bulk of my time doing is running my LLC and the companion podcast called Triloquy. So what me and my team, shout out to my co-host Scott Blankenship, what we affirm in that project is that every culture has music, and every one of those musics has something that is foundationally classic about them. So what we do and what we're trying to inspire in other individuals and in arts institutions is taking the phrase classical music and including, we have that word inclusion, right? And including classic styles of music from other cultures and decentering the white gaze and that Western European perspective on what is art music. So what are some specific examples? Eons before there was anyone named Strauss or even Bach, there was music being codified in the Indian subcontinent, across East Asia, the motherland, the African continent. And in each one of those cultures, you have music that is classic, that is foundational, that is classical. So when I talk about breaking down that phrase, I talk about understanding that we've been conditioned to apply that phrase to the foundational music, some of the foundational music, not even all, but some of the foundational music of Western Europe, when in actuality, it will benefit the genre and us all, the arts in general, to really spread that out and insert other classic aesthetics into the conversation. Again, going back to this piece of music from Deflator Mouse, once upon a time in certain spaces, a Hungarian czardas would not have been considered anything classical, anything high art. I think that's a part of the conversation that's happening within the opera for that character to be there. That has changed over time. I think we're in a time now where we can expand that even further and consider so much more classical music. And in doing that, again, we have the opportunity to reach so much more people and make art spaces look as colorful as we allege to want them to be. But what does that cost? Again, as we were talking about earlier, a change in aesthetic. We have to be willing to maybe sit Mozart to the side for an Indian raga, or tell Mr. Strauss, we'll get to you next time. Here's an opera that uses hip hop aesthetics or Black imagery or whatever you want to fill in there. So I think, I hope that answers what you were asking when we were talking about that cultural gatekeeping. We're talking about undoing the conditioning and the miseducation that surrounds art music and the arts in general.
What would you do with an opera company that's unhinged as this?
Sure. Yeah. Well, you know, what I was thinking about when you as you're asking us to wrap up here is the fact that music is how our story has been told. Music is how our stories have been told. So when we're talking about giving space and shining a light on music, I think we have a responsibility to understand what story is being told and how we can, you know, tell the story in a way that can benefit our lives today. Yes, I think Deflator Mouse is an incredible opera. As I said, I've performed it many times. I would love to have the opportunity again. What space are we feeling, and what opportunity do we have to tell the story in a way that can benefit us? I think the media that we watched earlier is a great example of that. And I think, you know, as we continue to expand our creativity in this COVID world and what we hope to be a post COVID world, I think we have to, you know, start to think about how can our art, how can we use our resources to spread awareness that will inspire action for greater change. I think, you know, we're doing what we can on the digital platform, and there's some, you know, really great movement happening. But if I can leave folks with anything, is that, you know, again, music is how our story has been told, and we have to really take a big responsibility when we're talking about creating art and providing spaces for that art. The opera Deflator Mouse, as I mentioned last night, you know, it's about champagne, and it ends, you know, in that celebratory way. We all want to get to that celebration, but there's a lot of work that has to be put into it. And the arts can be a tool to that end. So we just need to always make sure that we're centering those sorts of things when we're moving forward, in my opinion, in our creation and in our advocacy within the arts.